The Capitals' odds of winning the Stanley Cup next season?
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals. I'm so glad you decided to join me today. As always, this podcast is free and available on all the major platforms. And I want to thank you for making this your first listen or view of the day. Yes, this podcast is also available in video form, so head on over to YouTube and check it out. My name is Dan Holme. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, I know that the Stanley Cup was just won the other day, but already they're talking about the odds of who is going to win the Stanley Cup next season and where do the Capitals finish in all of that. Then later in the show, we will talk about Peter Laviolettes and his new home in the NHL. And if there's one free agent that the Capitals could bring back to this team, who would that be? And that is where we'll start today's show. As we know, last season, it didn't go according to plan. There was a myriad of injuries. And just overall, the Caps didn't have a really good season, all things considered, except for the month of December. And one key piece moved out at the trade deadline that I think to some Caps fans, I think that to some Caps players, I think they wish they could get back. And that player is Dimitry Orlov. And don't get me wrong, I do like the return that the Capitals got for Dimitry Orlov. They got that first round pick that they ended up flipping to Toronto to get Rasmus Sandin to this team. I like that move. But one of the things that this Caps team is looking for is stability. And I know this team wants to get younger. I know it wants to get faster. But if you take a look at the Vegas Golden Knights, who just won the Stanley Cup, is that a team that was exclusively veterans or exclusively rookies? No, it was a good mixture of both, and dare I say more veterans than rookies. So, the thing that we hear about this team all the time, and I spoke about this, and if you're an everydayer, you know what I'm talking about, is what people say is this team needs to get younger and it needs to get faster. And how sick ultimately I am of hearing that about this team needs to get younger and faster. And they do. They are one of the oldest teams roster-wise in the NHL, and they could stand to get a bit younger. Don't get me wrong, there are some old players on the team. See Oshie and Backstrom, and dare I say Ovechkin's even getting up there. But you do need some veteran players. And one player I think would be an interesting return if they could come together in the middle, meet me in the middle, is Dimitry Orlov. And what do we know when he left? Ultimately, why he left is that him and his agent were looking for a 7-year deal. And the rumor mill out there was that Brian McClellan and the Capitals were in for about a 3-year deal or maybe a 4-year deal. So I think that if both sides could soften their stance a little bit, maybe he would be a good addition to this team if they can get him cheap. That is the question. How cheap could they get Dimitry Orlov? I don't want them to give up the farm to get Dimitry Orlov back to this team. But if they can come together in the middle, then I am all about it. I think they should do it. I think he would make a good addition to this team. If you just remember, his stability, his likability on the roster and just his many contributions to this team, I think that would be a good thing. It's just they're going to, if I was the GM right now, I would offer him a 3-year deal. And if Dimitry Orlov is game, then he's a Capital. And if he's not, I'd let him go. Again, I don't think at his age, and one of the things that was spoke about is that he says that he thinks this is going to be his last NHL contract, and it very well may be, just considering his age. That's why he's looking for a contract that's a bit longer. 7 years is what the rumor is. I don't think the Capitals should be all in on Orlov for a 7-year deal. That is a deal that is going to sour. But like I said, if they can get him on a 3-year deal at kind of a respectable rate, then I think they should pursue it. And this was one of the things that I had read In the hockey writers, before the 2023 NHL trade deadline passed, the Caps traded Orlov to Boston. The soon to be 32-year-old thrived in Boston, and the Bruins naturally want to keep him around, yet financially it will be too challenging. Furthermore, Orlov had expressed excitement about hitting the free agent market. What's more intriguing, however, is that specifically mentioned that he would love to return to DC. And I know that there was a relationship with Alex Ovechkin. I know they vacationed together. I know all of that. And so a lot of what I'm hearing is that Alex Ovechkin kind of bristled at it. He was not too happy that they traded his good friend and his longtime teammate Dimitry Orlov to the Bruins. And let's be honest, Dimitry Orlov destroyed it. He played so well in Boston that is why a lot of people think that they should try to get him back to this team. I think that ultimately, like they say, Boston would like to keep him. It's just that, I think that Boston went all in on winning. They got, a lot of big pieces. They had their best record. And, I think that a lot of people are already etching their name on the side of the Stanley Cup. As it turns out, they disappeared faster than anyone thought. So that is sometimes the way that it goes. But for Dimitry Orlov, when noting that the Capitals' blue line needs to improve, an Orlov reunion should be considered. He showed the Bruins that he is still a major difference maker at this juncture of his career, and the Caps could use his mixture of offensive production, steady defensive play, and physicality from the point. Again, due to all of this, I see the Capitals and Orlov getting something done. Again, this was in the hockey writers, and it doesn't hurt to dream. But for me, and just, like I say, doing this show, I read a lot of articles. I listen to a lot of podcasts and the NHL Network and all of that. And for me, that is what I'm hearing, is that he wants this long deal. It's going to be interesting to see if there is a taker. I think that ultimately Dmitry Orlov told the press that he would consider coming back here. He doesn't want to offend the fan base. He doesn't want to offend a lot of his former players. I ultimately think that he enjoyed his time in DC. Just thinking back on it, I think that, there probably wasn't a really great relationship between him and Peter Laviolette. He had some kind of negative things to say about Peter Laviolette as he left. Or I guess I could say maybe constructive criticism, I guess is what you could say. He was wondering why Matt Irwin was getting more time over Alex Alexiev. So he kind of, spoke of his displeasure with the way things were going. But now that Peter Laviolette's out of the equation and you have Spencer Carberry, could he be game for coming back to this team? It is an interesting thing to think about. I think that, again, he still brings that physical game, a good two-way defenseman. Could he be the stability that the Capitals need? The big question, the huge elephant in the room, of course, is then who comes out of the lineup to accommodate? If you're an everydayer, I spoke about this in the last couple episodes. I spoke about Lucas Johansson and Alex Alexiev, two blue liners that are vying for spots on this team. The big problem is, where do they fit? Where would Dimitry Orlov fit? Most of the Caps blue line got new deals. John Carlson, we know, is under deal. We know that Faravari is an RFA that's looking for a new deal, but Jensen and Trevor Van Riemsdyk and Rasmus Sandin, those guys are under contract. So where is he going to fit in? I guess you could bump one guy down or make one guy a scratch, but given the fact that you gave these guys new deals, again, it would have to be very appealing for the Capitals. It would have to be a shorter term deal, and it would have to be a cheaper deal for me if I was the GM to even consider it. All right, coming up here, we will talk about Peter Laviolette. I knew that he was going to find a new home. I mean, let's face it, he has a pedigree of winning and is one of the most winningest U.S.-born coaches. It only stood to reason that he would be able to find a new job within the NHL. And he was able to do that. Where did he find a job in the NHL? We'll talk about that straight ahead. Buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun that you'll have. One of the things that I love about Game Time is it's summertime and all the major events come to your city or town, but finding tickets can be difficult. That is why you need Game Time, and that is why I love Game Time. Snag the tickets without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make sure and subscribe or follow Locked On Capitals wherever you find your podcasts and on YouTube. I have a lot of great guests lined up for you this summer, and I also have you guys covered with the draft and free agency. So make sure and follow or subscribe to Locked On Capitals today. All right, in this next segment here, we are going to talk about Peter Laviolette's new home. And next week, I will be on Locked On Rangers to talk to them about what my thoughts are on Peter Laviolette, and asking me right now, Dan, what are your thoughts on Peter Laviolette? My thoughts on Peter Laviolette is I think that he was a victim of circumstance to a certain extent. I think that COVID, really, stopped him in his tracks. I think that the myriad of injuries stopped him in his tracks. So if you take a look at COVID and all the injuries that he faced this last season, he was up against it pretty much his entire tenure with the Capitals. I understand ultimately why they moved on from him as a head coach. This was the first time that they had missed the playoffs in quite some time. And, there was a feeling, if you listen to the different beat writers and as I hear different things on breakdown day, that I think to a certain extent he may have lost the locker room. Not everyone was in lockstep with his thought process. And, I think that, some of the coaches, he blamed Forsyth and that kind of thing. I think that the locker room had just grown a bit stale, if you will. So they inserted Spencer Carberry, some fresh blood. But now let's talk about Peter Laviolette and his new home, the New York Rangers. It doesn't get any bigger than that. And he is going to be under the microscope in New York, as they love the New York Rangers in that city. I think he's up for the task, as he, has a pedigree of winning. He doesn't ultimately get his desired result in the Stanley Cup. I know that he was able to do it before, but if you're just going to kind of measure how his last run was with the Capitals, it's going to be a different lineup. Hopefully, I guess it depends on what the Rangers are looking out for from Peter Laviolette. Are they looking for them to play a lot of young players, or was there a mandate to Peter Laviolette to win hockey games? And I think that that's where there's a bit of a disconnect with the fans and Peter Laviolette and Brian McClellan. There was a mandate to Peter Laviolette to win hockey games, period. There was not a mandate for him to integrate young players. And I think that, a lot of the grief that Lavi gets is because they feel like Peter Laviolette did a poor job integrating young players. Well, for one, that's kind of a lot Brian McClellan, the GM. But number two, there was a mandate to win hockey games, to squeeze as much juice out of this lineup as humanly as possible. He wasn't able to get it done. And not again, like I spoke of here, COVID, myriad of injuries. He was kind of up against it. And, I know what people are going to say. Well, every team had to face COVID. And I hear that. But the myriad of injuries, the Capitals were one of the most injured teams in all of the NHL. So what did they do? They hired the next coach, but the mandate is a little bit different for Spencer Carberry. Brian McClellan has said as much as he wants Spencer Carberry to be able to work with the young players and the veteran players, and hopefully integrate some of these young players that we've heard about for quite some time. Don't get me wrong. He wants Spencer Carberry to win games, but he also wants to slowly bring along a lot of these young players that we've heard about for years. See Connor McMichael, Hendrix Lapierre, Vinny Iario, Ethan Frank, Beck Malenstein. You know who I'm talking about. They're not all going to be able to be on the Caps this next season, but maybe a couple of them can. And I think that's Spencer Carberry's job. But what about Peter Laviolette and his new home, the New York Rangers? Again, he struck it rich, signing a really great deal. Peter Laviolette's unemployment didn't last long, as the former Caps head coach has been tapped to replace Gerard Gallant with the New York Rangers. Again, I'm not real sure it's an upgrade, to be honest with you. I'm not totally against Gerard Gallant. But I guess that's up to them. The Rangers announced Laviolette's hiring, with GM Chris Drury touting his extensive experience as a head coach in the NHL. We are thrilled that Peter will be the next head coach of the New York Rangers, Drury said. With Peter's extensive experience as a head coach in the NHL, as well as his success in teams he's had at several levels throughout his career, we are excited about what the future holds with him leading our team. So what is the book on Peter Laviolette? He is a good coach for a couple years and then just burns out. He loses the locker room just with that hard stance that he takes. It's followed him throughout his NHL career. And that's one of the things. Is he going to be able to change his ways? According to Pierre LeBrun of TSN, the contract is for 3 years and will be worth just under $5 million per season. He is not going to be hurting financially. The Rangers and Gallant agreed to a mutual parting of ways on May 6th after the team lost its first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs to the Devils. Gallant led the Rangers to back-to-back seasons with more than 100 points. In the regular season, they lost in the Eastern Conference Finals during the 2021-2022 season in 6 games after taking a 2-0 series lead against Tampa. And, the interesting thing for me about the Rangers is, during the regular season, they were, near the top of the Metro Division. They were poised for bigger things. But a lot of teams were. Take a look at Boston, for example. Sometimes the best laid plans go to waste. The Boston Bruins, beating all sorts of records for wins, and they just evaporate so quick. You could also put the Rangers in that category. Is Peter Laviolette going to have better luck? I think, probably going to have to tweak the roster a little bit. Prior to Gallant's hiring in 2021, the Rangers hadn't won a playoff series since the 16-17 series. So don't despair, Capitals fans. They are not the only team in the Metro that has lost their way. Lavi parted ways with the Caps on April 14th, one day after the end of the regular season. The Caps missed the playoffs this season for the first time since the 13-14 season. Adam Oates era, we remember that. Their 80 points were the fewest of the franchise in 82-game season since 06-07. So you do see why the change needed to be made. Just looking at it on paper, the Capitals have a pedigree of doing great things, making it to the playoffs. It would be really hard to sell to the Caps fans, and Ted Leonsis for that matter, I'm going to bring back that head coach that tanked this team, or at least he was in charge of this team, the head coach that has missed the playoffs for the first time since 13-14 and the fewest points since 06-07. I don't want to forget about the fact of the injuries, major injuries. Tom Wilson missed a good chunk of the season. Nick Backstrom, John Carlson. For me, as I record this in June, I will tell you this. I've said it all along. If you're an everydayer, you know that if they had Wilson, Carlson, and Backstrom the entire season, I think they would have made it to the playoffs, maybe as a wild card. But I do, in fact, think they would have made it. But, looking at Peter Laviolette and his future with the Rangers, I wish him nothing but the best. I ultimately do think he is a good coach. And I've kind of, had his back through all of this on this podcast. Thinking that he did a pretty good job. He was a victim of circumstance. I still do believe that, but I think that the Capitals needed a momentum change, and a momentum change they will get. All right, coming up here, the Stanley Cup just finished up as they crowned the Vegas Golden Knights the Stanley Cup winners. But who is the favorite to win the Stanley Cup next season, and where do the Capitals fit in? We'll talk about that straight ahead. Bird Dogs. Let me tell you about our next sponsor here, Bird Dogs. I love me some Bird Dogs. Why? Because they're comfortable. Yes, oftentimes women wear comfortable clothes because they're comfortable, but guys, most of the time, they wear clothes like jeans or khakis, or they wear those cargo shorts that, let's face it, went out of style about 20 years ago. That is why you need Bird Dogs. Bird Dogs stretch khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and give your legs a truly sculpted look. Bird Dog shorts do the exact same thing as a lot of the other big names out there, but fit way better. They fit way better than regular shorts. They are made of a stiff Restricting cotton, Bird Dog fixed the issues of inventing cloud knit fabric that looks just like khaki but stretches so you get a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. Bird dogs use anti stink sweat wicking fabric that keep you cool and dry all day long. And everyone needs to be cool and dry all day long. So, this is what you need to do, Caps fans. Go to birddogs.com/lockedonnhl for a free Yeti style tumbler with your order. I've used it every day since I've had it. Keeps my coffee warm on the way to work. I love it. That's birddogs.com/lockedonnhl for a free Yeti style tumbler. You won't want to take off your bird dogs. We promise you. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, like I talked about earlier in the show, kind of breaking down the show, the Stanley Cup was just won. As you listen to this a couple of days ago, the Vegas Golden Knights won the Stanley Cup. Yes, let's not forget history here that the Washington Capitals knocked out the Golden Knights and won a Stanley Cup. Let's not forget that. Big ups go to them for winning a Stanley Cup after being in the league for such a short period of time. I mean, ultimately, some people are like, well, what do you think of the Golden Knights winning? They've only been around for a short period of time. What do I think? Good for them. They were able to assemble a good team, good coach, good GM. They earned it. They won it. Tip of the hat goes to them. I don't think that there was any dirty-handed plays. You take a look at the Florida Panthers, for example. They did their level best, but it's a tough thing. Just watching the Stanley Cup, and I was talking about this with the wife, is that making it to the final round and being the team that's eliminated, and this is kind of a crazy thing, but this is just the way I think, is almost worse for me than just getting eliminated at the end of the regular season. It's just getting so close, so close. You can reach the top rung of the ladder, and someone kicks their foot and you fall down the ladder. You were so close. One could think maybe you would have been better off not even getting on the ladder in the first place. The season was over. You knew it was over. You saw how high it is. You can't climb a ladder that high unless you had the strength and the muscle that you knew that you could confidently climb every rung of that ladder. Let's face it, the Capitals knew that they weren't going to be able to do that. It would have been a remote possibility for them to win it. So that, again, it would have been nice for them to make it to the playoffs, but it's kind of a crazy way that my mind works. I'm almost glad that they lost and they didn't make it to the playoffs at all, other than make it to all the way up. I've got the top rung and poof, free falling down. You missed the playoffs. You made it all the way there, but you lost. I mean, I guess good for them, but I'm just saying, as a Capitals fan, if they would have made it to the final round and would have lost, I would have been pretty bummed out. I'm already over this last season. I'm looking forward to next season, but good on the Vegas Golden Knights for doing it. And let's see where the Capitals are poised to be next season, or what are the odds? This is FanDuel sports book, and they had this thing. I saw this in RMNB. The Caps are coming off their worst full 82 game season in 16 years, which I spoke about in the second segment, finishing 25th overall in the league standings. That sort of abject failure on top of the rookie head coach and a year older core has heavily impacted the team's betting odds for next season. The Caps are tied for the 8th worst odds to win the Stanley Cup in 23-24. So the odds makers don't have the Caps pegged too well. But what do they not know? They don't know what Brian McClellan is going to do during free agency. He might have something up his sleeve. Let's not forget the big impact. And this is one of the biggest ones that comes to mind, and somewhat recent, is when he signed Brooks Orpik and Matt Niskanen. What a difference maker that was to the blue line. What if he had something like that up his sleeve for the forward, the top six? That could be a game changer, and that is right now what those odds makers don't know. So what they are is they're making odds based on the roster right now and the head coach and that kind of thing. And it's not looking too good. And it didn't look too good last year. Caps beat writers already panned the team. Yes, the very people that cover the team didn't think they were going to make it to the playoffs. And guess what? They were right. I was wrong. Yes, I'm okay with admitting that. I thought they were at least going to be able to make it to the first round. As it turns out, Wasn't meant to be. Wasn't meant to be. So, taking a look at the odds, the way too early pick to win the Stanley Cup next year is the Colorado Avalanche at plus 800, followed by two Canadian teams in Toronto Maple Leafs plus 1100 and the Edmonton Oilers plus 1100. Really, we're still going with the Maple Leafs and the Oilers. I mean, if the Caps don't win, I would love nothing more for a Canadian team to win. It's been a long time. Ultimately, of course, I want the Caps to win, but it would be refreshing to let one of the Canadian teams win. The next group of clubs includes the now defending champion Vegas Golden Knights plus 1,300, as well as the past season's powerhouse Boston Bruins. Let's not, make odds too early. Everyone picked the odds based on last season that the Bruins we're going to win the Stanley Cup. On the other end of the spectrum, the Anaheim Ducks plus 15,000 have the worst odds, followed by the San Jose Sharks, Arizona Coyotes, and Columbus Blue Jackets. The Caps come in just after the Pittsburgh Penguins, who also missed the playoffs, but they have much better odds comparatively, despite their whole off-season wholesale changes. The most peculiar listing may be the Seattle Kraken, who are coming off a very impressive first postseason appearance and have the worst odds than several teams that missed the playoffs entirely. Again, this piece in RMNB. So again, the Capitals are not poised, or the bet makers, the people that, that make money on this, on gambling. And, one of the things I talk about is it does make watching the games that much more fun. And to be fair, it does. And why is it? Because sometimes you can make money on games and stuff. And sometimes even if it's a game you're not that interested in, you can, if you have a little bit of money on it, it makes that much more exciting. So that is why companies like FanDuel out there do such a great job doing this kind of stuff, because there are people that like to bet. And it is an admission. This is the way too early odds of who's going to win the Stanley Cup. But, interesting for me. Interesting. It's one of the things that if you are wrong on a consistent basis, you can almost start to question how you're coming to these conclusions. So if they're picking the Toronto Maple Leafs, near the top, and the Edmonton Oilers, two teams that, let's face it, were pretty good last year, all things considered, but still quite a ways away from winning a Stanley Cup. I don't put a lot of faith in this right now, and I guess I want to see where those odds stack up after free agency, after we know what happens between, we know the Stanley Cup is done, but between now and the beginning of camp, that can change things dramatically. Head coaching changes, player roster changes, who's going to be the next great goalie on the next team, that kind of thing. That will be an interesting thing for me. But, it is interesting. The Seattle Kraken, and I kind of agree with that assessment on that one. The Seattle Kraken were a team that made it. They did pretty well, but when I watched them, I was never very impressed. I mean, they had some good players, but they didn't have a lot of great players. When you watch the Vegas Golden Knights, they had a lot of great players. Same goes for the Panthers. With star-laden teams and just some really great players. And those are the players that you need to win Stanley Cups. Meh lineup is not going to win you a Stanley Cup. You don't back into victory into a Stanley Cup. You might back your way into the first round of the playoffs, but you sure as heck are not going to back into a Stanley Cup victory. And I think that ultimately that is why the Seattle Kraken are where they're at. The Capitals, why are they at where they're at, Dan? As someone that covers this team, again, it is a team that is 1 year older, and it is a head coach that is an unproven commodity as a head coach. Again, as I record this in June, I would love to prove all of the NHL wrong. As I said, this same thing last offseason, to just prove everyone wrong, that this geriatric team has what it takes, that Spencer Carberry can be the rookie whisperer, and maybe he's the one that can just fine-tune Evgeny Kuznetsov's game a little bit and maybe refocus Anthony Mantha if he's on this team again, and get some of these players like Connor McMichael, integrate him into the lineup and, get him where he needs to be, not, down in Hershey or up in the press box, and maybe work, a player from Hershey down on the blue line, something like that. Something that's going to take this Capitals team over the top that the odds maker said, hey, we didn't even see that coming, man. Maybe this Capitals team can go somewhere. Those are the changes that I think need to be made. I think that part of it is the Caps have not made any big moves yet. They haven't done anything to kind of push them over the top. If they can land a top 6 forward, could be a game changer. There's a lot of stars on this team, a lot of goal scoring potential. Let's take a look at how great this Capitals team would have been if Wilson was in there. He was top three in goals a couple of years ago. Kuznetsov, same thing, top three in goals a couple of years ago. And Alex Ovechkin. Those are three really great dynamic players that could have been game changers. You could also put Dylan Strome into that category, that kind of thing. So it is going to be an interesting offseason. I just like to go over these odds and things that I read about the Capitals and a lot of these other teams already getting panned, and the NHL season just wrapped up. It's just really kind of interesting to talk about with you guys about. All right, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals. And DC fans, Washington Nationals baseball is in full effect. Make sure and subscribe or follow Locked On Nationals. I love that podcast. He covers the team so well, but it doesn't end there. If you're a fan of the Commanders, there's Locked On Commanders and there's Locked On Wizards. So we have you covered for all major DC sports. So make sure and follow those shows wherever you find your podcasts and on YouTube. And if you want to still listen about hockey, you're listening to the Locked On Capitals podcast. You love hockey. Maybe you like the NHL in general. Head on over to Locked On NHL, as they have you covered all summer long with all the comings and goings and news that breaks in the NHL. Head on over to Locked On NHL, again, wherever you find your podcasts and on YouTube. All right, my name is Dan Holme of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I'll talk to you guys again next time.